Welcome back to another Honkai Impact tier list. I had already made one pretty recently, but I think a lot of things have changed in this version alone that I thought I would want to mention for all the new players coming in. And just quick disclaimer, the Honkai Impact meta moves very fast, so this tier list will most likely not last very long, unfortunately, but please do check the pinned comment for any updates to the tier list. Now, Honkai Impact has a very unique problem where all the Part 2 Valkyries are actually very strong, and it might be hard to choose which ones to pull for. And generally, my advice for new players, first of all, is just to pull for the new Valkyries and skip the old ones. However, if you do like some of these old Valkyries and are interested in playing them because of their playstyle or just, waifu, then I'm creating this video to maybe show the pros and cons of each Valkyrie. Also, let me make it clear that if you want to truly be competitive in this game, you unfortunately can't choose to just have one very built team and then sack every other team. And this is due to the weather system in Honkai Impact. The weather system grants unique buffs or debuffs to certain types or elements, which means that you basically need at least one of each typing. Now, what's great about Part 2 Valkyries, though, is that they all work pretty much synergistically with each other. And what I mean is that you can basically use them as both DPSs and supports for each other, which means that you don't have to build 19 Valkyries like back then for each typing possible. However, there are some unique exceptions, which I will cover for each Valkyrie individually. So yeah, let's get started. Vita is the closest Valkyrie to a top tier to pull for right now. She provides both physical and elemental breach, which is essentially the equivalent of resistance shred. The thing about Vita is no other Valkyrie gives both breaches. In fact, the only other Valkyrie that actually gives elemental breach in a Part 2 teams is Senadina. She's a new best slot support for both Senadina and Schicksal Imperative, as well as a great support for Jovial Deception and Thelema. Since she was released this patch, of course, the bosses are tailor-made for her, so she's going to be top scoring and most of the bosses will see this patch. My only real issue with her is that she has only one good team as a DPS right now, and it's Coralie as well as the Herrscher Finality. But what's important is the Herrscher Finality has to have her new Divine Key and a Scander set. Without the new Herrscher Finality set, we're going to see like a 40% decrease in her DPS, so it is very important that you have the Herrscher Finality built. Thankfully, you can get the Herrscher Finality for free this patch if you spend enough crystals, and you can just forge her Stigmata set and then try to pull for her weapon. Now, another reason why I think Vita is such a strong pull is because she has this unknown Astral Ring attribute that hasn't been released yet, which means that she'll definitely have future use. Not to mention that, of course, she's mostly a support thanks to the breach she gives, which means that she will have better longevity than just a pure DPS Valkyrie. So that puts Vita right into the S tier. Jovial Deception is the premier physical and Stardust DPS for Part 2 teams. She basically dominates her bosses and no one can really compete with her. And just like Vita, she also has that unknown Astral Ring attribute, which may guarantee her future. Despite her monopoly on physical and Stardust weathers, there are a few issues I have with her. First of all, she's probably the closest we have to a pure DPS Part 2 Valkyrie. Although she can be used as a support, she is often not the best in slot support for anyone. However, it's very hard to ignore her complete dominance over physical and Stardust weathers. There is just zero competition against her bosses. Now, she does have issues as a physical Valkyrie. Unlike elemental Valkyries in Honkai Impact, physical Valkyries need crit rate. And if you don't have Lantern or Senadina or the Serapeum Astral Op to compensate for her lack of crit rate, then she will actually fall behind. Thankfully, she can be supported by Vita, which you should be pulling for anyways. So you should only have to build one more support if you pull for both Songque and Vita. So thanks to her dominance and future Astral Ring type, she gets an S tier. Thelema is a second S rank battlesuit released in Part 2, yet she seems to be one of the most relevant Valkyries we've seen so far. And the biggest reason for this is just because she has an insane time stop on her ultimate, which lets her do a lot of damage without actually running down the timer in Abyss or Memorial Arena. She is literally used in every single team except for Vita DPS's team, and she also seems to be the brute force Valkyrie of choice for Part 2 teams. And what I mean with that is that if you don't have the intended Valkyrie for a boss, then you can just use Thelema and she does pretty well. Now, it is worth mentioning that as a DPS, her rotations are very awkward if you don't have a Songque or Serapeum elf. This is because it is very hard to play her without her Astral Ring active. And it's also worth mentioning that she just isn't as relevant as a DPS anymore and has seemed to be relegated as a support. She will be available in the special Fest supply this patch, which should give you 20 free pulls. So if you're a Dolphin and you have all your other teams fleshed out, then she might be a worthy pickup. Thanks to her relevance in almost every Part 2 team, I'm happy to put her in the S tier. Schicksal's Imperative is the premier Quantum Lightning DPS. In fact, she is basically built to only fight Quantum bosses due to how fast she breaks their shields. However, she does also serve as a Lunar Vow support, and her new best one at that. The thing about Quantum bosses is they rarely show up, but when they do, if you don't own a Quantum Valkyrie like Schicksal's Imperative, then it is a pain in the ass to do those bosses. But at the same time, at a normal week, you also don't expect to see a Quantum boss. At least for this current patch, Schicksal's Imperative seems to only serve the purpose of beating quantum bosses, as she's not really a best in slot support for any other Part 2 teams, although she is a best in slot support for Lunar Vow. However, she does seem to support Sparkle next update when she comes out, so this might give her some new needed upgrades. And thankfully, she also utilizes Vita, so you'd only have to build one other Valkyrie besides Vita, such as Thelema, to finish her team. So thanks to her unmatched power in quantum bosses, as well as her potential future upgrades with Sparkle, I will for now put her as a low A tier. So I'm going to save some time by doing both the Herrscher Finality as well as the trio in one go. This ranking is assuming that you got the newest standard set for Herrscher Finality. But basically, if you want to play Vita DPS, the new Herrscher Finality set, as well as just her in general, is completely needed. I said this earlier, but without her, Vita stays like a 40% DPS drop. And as stated earlier, you can get her for free if you spend about 33,000 crystals, which makes her pretty close to a budget Valkyrie actually, because all you need to pull for her is her guns, since her stigmata is forgeable. And if you just don't know what her new set does, it basically makes her an Astral Wing Valkyrie, which makes her compatible with other Part 2 Valkyries. And as a DPS, she's honestly pretty good at brute forcing some bosses if you don't have the necessary Valkyries for them. The Herrscher trio has basically been revived thanks to this new set, although I wouldn't get your hopes too high. I think this is the equivalent of just getting a Divine Key upgrade for a Valkyrie. I think the trio by themselves will only last as long as a Divine Key upgrade normally does, which is like usually 2 to 3 patches. However, they've basically gone back their monopoly on imaginary teams, and if you use the Herrscher of Origin DPS with the Herrscher Finality support, then she will become basically also a brute force Part 1 Valkyrie, almost on par with Lunar Vow. Although the requirement would be that you need Lunar Vow to support alongside Herrscher Finality. So now, speaking of the Herrscher of Truth separately from the Herrscher trio, she used to be called the universal elemental support of Part 1 teams, but I think more and more that statement has fallen flat. With Lunar Vow, you don't really see her used alongside Herrscher of Truth anymore unless you don't own Schicksal's Imperative or Cosmic Expression. So she's basically only required for the Herrscher trio as well as Part 1 fire teams, which are falling out of favor. So I'd probably put Finality in A tier because of Vita's dependence on her, and then the other two in B tier just because the Herrscher trio has been revived. However, I don't think they'll last that long, to be honest. Lantern is the premier Part 2 fire DPS. Of the Part 2 S-rank Valkyries, I think she's on the weaker end, and I think this is just due to the fact that she unfortunately doesn't have any cool gimmick, like for example, Thelema's time stop. However, for any hit count bosses, she does seem to basically be required since no one else can output as many hits as she can. And as a support, you'll often see her paired up with Thelema because they have cool synergy where their charge attacks will often lead into each other's QTEs. She has decent relevance in Part 2 teams, although not nearly as much as Thelema. At least for now, she's still pretty relevant, but I think she'll be one of the first Part 2 Valkyries to unfortunately fall off, because I think we're starting to see signs of her falling off already. Not to mention that Sparkle's coming out next update, which is also a fire Valkyrie. I just can't recommend her as much as the other Part 2 Valkyries. But at least for now, she is still in A tier because she still has decent relevance, as well as she's still needed for hit count bosses.
Vita and Senadina often compete for the same support slot in most Part 2 teams because they both have Elemental Breach, and Senadina is really only better for Wheel of Destiny. But this isn't that big of an issue because in a Memorial Arena, you'll probably come across a situation where you can't use Vita because she's used for a different boss, so you'll have to use Senadina anyways. Thanks.
However, I just think that if you're going to pull for anyone with best supply, you should probably pull for Thelema and then Lantern before Senadina. Especially since Vita basically just replaces Senadina in all teams where she's used. And although Vita isn't as good for both Destiny teams, she's still very close to her in DPS. But holistically speaking, I think it'd be unfair to give her anything under an A. To save some time, I'm going to be ranking both Coralie and Helia together. Coralie is currently the best in slot support for Vita, and she will be guaranteed the best in slot support for her next patch as well because Sparkle will not be supporting Vita. Although Coralie is not really best in slot for any other teams, she's just extremely cheap to build and a great substitute, and I think you literally get her gears for free, so there's no reason to not build her. Helia, on the other hand, has unfortunately basically fallen off. She is not best in slot in any teams anymore, although she is a great substitute for Senadina DPS as well as Schicksal Imperative. I would only consider gearing Helia if you don't have Vita for some reason, as well as any other supports for Senadina. So I put Coralie in B tier just because I think she'd be the first to be replaced in Vita's DPS team, but she is very cheap to build though. And Helia in C tier just because she is not best in slot or required for any teams. Lunar Vow is still the strongest Part 1 Valkyrie and still probably considered the Herrscher of brute forcing without actually being a Herrscher. Her usage has not seemed to actually decrease much since my last video, which probably puts her in the same power level as I last ranked her. In fact, thanks to Schicksal Imperative, she's kind of seen an upsurge in use because Schicksal's Imperative has actually upgraded her teams pretty far. She does use a high usage rate for Part 1 bosses in Memorial Arena, especially since she still out DPSs many of the Part 2 Valkyries for those bosses. I wouldn't recommend anyone roll for her unless you're like an actual whale, but yeah, she's still pretty good. I would put her B tier just because she isn't really as relevant as the other S rank Part 2 Valkyries, but still pretty relevant. Okay, I'm gonna be ranking Cosmic Expression and Eden the same, just to save some time, but also because they both serve the same purpose. I know the footage shows them not really supporting Lunar Vow, but they're both basically only Lunar Vow supports these days. Back in 7.6 and below, they used to be used together as supports for Lunar Vow, but due to Schicksal Imperative being the new best support for Lunar Vow, they've kind of been separated, and as a result, both their user rate has dropped. That being said, you're still going to need one or the other to be built for Lunar Vow, but the thing is, you don't need both to be built anymore. Although this is under the assumption that you actually have Schickal's Imperative. If you're like me and you didn't pull for Schickal's Imperative, then you can still use both as supports. And honestly, the damage drop-off from Schickal's Imperative isn't actually that big. In Memorial Arena, I can still get top 100 on Lunar Vow bosses even without Schickal's Imperative. But it's clear that they're not as useful as they used to be, so they're both going to be going into the C tier, unfortunately. The Fenghuang of Visscitude is unfortunately starting to meet her end. She only sees use when the Herrscher Rhyme Star is up in Memorial Arena. Unfortunately, she just lacks the DPS required to match the brute force power of Lunar Vow. However, there is some hope for her because Sparkle is leaked to be a Ignite support for Part 1 teams, which could easily put her back in the meta. However, at least this patch, she just unfortunately doesn't see much use, so for now, she'll be getting a C tier. However, Sparkle's arrival might be a bad sign for Chrono Navi because she is completely dependent on the Fenghuang of Visscitude needing her. So unfortunately, I don't think Chrono Navi will be doing well next patch, and so I'm going to be preemptively putting her in the D tier. So you just might be wondering what happened to Part 1 Physical and Ice teams, and well, the fact is, they are all irrelevant now, unfortunately. I have not seen a single physical boss that requires a Part 1 Physical team. And so unfortunately, I think they're dead for now. However, seeing how MiHoYo did revive the Herrscher trio, I do think that there could be some hope for them in the future through maybe a Divine Key. Now, Ice teams have it worse for sure because all their Memorial Arena bosses have been taken over by Lunar Vow and the other Part 2 Valkyries. Whereas the physical Part 1 teams, we just don't see their bosses anymore. So if we do see them, they'd probably be around the D tier at least. So yeah, this is the final tier list. I know a lot of you guys probably skip to the end to see what it is, but I recommend you guys actually do watch at least some of the individual Valkyrie summaries, because I don't think this tier list, like the picture alone, is nuanced enough to tell you why certain Valkyries are certain tiers, as well as like maybe this Valkyrie is not this tier because of XX conditions. Anyways, please subscribe so I can beat Mr. Beast subscribers. I'm only 322 million subscribers away.